The air inside the studio was already electric long before the cameras began to roll. There was something different about this particular episode of Stephen Colbert's show, something simmering beneath the surface. Elon Musk, the evening's guest, had shown up with an unusual edge. It wasn't the quiet confidence or quirky charisma audiences had come to expect. Instead, there was a palpable arrogance clinging to him like static, as though he had arrived with something to prove, and no patience to play nice. Colbert, always sharp and good-humored, sensed it the moment they shook hands backstage. Elon barely made eye contact, muttered a greeting, and then strode off toward the green room without another word. It wasn't just nerves, it was calculated distance. Stephen had interviewed presidents, actors, and tech moguls alike, but never had. He'd been given such a cold shoulder by someone who had once used his platform to charm the world. Something had changed, and Stephen didn't like it. The show opened as usual. A few monologue jokes, a smattering of applause, and then the introduction of Musk. The crowd roared when Elon walked on stage, but instead of acknowledging the audience, with a humble nod or wave, he simply adjusted his jacket and sat down. From the moment he spoke, the tone was off. His answers were short, clipped, and laced with an undertone of superiority. When asked about his recent ventures, instead of engaging in thoughtful discussion, he launched into a self-congratulatory rant, brushing off any suggestion that others had contributed to his success. It was no longer a conversation, but a monologue drenched in ego. Stephen tried to pull the energy back toward something light-hearted, attempting to add some levity to the increasingly awkward segment, but Elon wasn't playing along. He interrupted Stephen mid-sentence, dismissed one of his jokes as outdated, and even questioned his intelligence with a thinly veiled insult masked behind a smirk. The audience chuckled uneasily, unsure if it was part of the bit, or if something real was beginning to unravel. As the segment continued, Stephen's usual poise began to fray at the edges. His eyes narrowed slightly and his responses grew more direct. He abandoned the charm and instead matched Elon's energy with biting professionalism. What had started as an interview quickly turned into a duel of personalities, with the crowd shifting between laughter and silence, unsure how to react. The tension was now undeniable, not just to those in the room but to the millions watching from home. It wasn't one specific moment that triggered the shift. It was the accumulation. The smug comments, the constant interruptions, the thinly veiled jabs. Elon wasn't there to engage. He was there to assert dominance. And Stephen Colbert, a master of public discourse, wasn't about to let himself be humiliated on his own stage. When Elon took a swing at the very concept of talk shows, calling them outdated relics that survive only by feeding off the relevance of people like him, something in Stephen finally cracked. His posture stiffened, his tone sharpened, and the smile that had lingered out of politeness vanished completely. What followed wasn't explosive, but surgical. Stephen began to dismantle Musk's arguments with cold precision, exposing contradictions, mocking the performative arrogance, and highlighting how often Elon deflected real questions in favor of grandstanding. The audience, sensing the shift in power, responded with louder applause. The tide was turning, and Stephen wasn't done, yet Elon didn't back down. If anything, he escalated. He fired back with an intensity that startled even the crew, throwing subtle but personal digs at Colbert's career, mocking his influence, and belittling his role in public discourse. The interview had fully collapsed. This was now an all-out battle for control, and neither man was backing away. The camera stayed wide, capturing the stiff body language, the eyes locked in controlled fury, and the silence that fell between each cutting remark. And then, just when it seemed the segment might derail entirely, Stephen leaned forward with a slow, deliberate calm. He didn't shout, he didn't curse, but the energy shifted so drastically that the entire room froze. Elon, who had been riding high on his own bravado, suddenly looked less sure. For the first time he leaned back, arms crossed tightly, the smirk gone. Stephen had landed a blow. Not physical, but far more damaging. It was a truth, laid bare for all to see, and Elon had no immediate retort. The commercial break couldn't come fast enough. The moment the cameras cut to commercial, the studio floor went silent in a way that wasn't normal. Crew members avoided eye contact, assistants hovered without moving, and the audience whispered among themselves. Even the laughter had stopped. On stage, Stephen sat upright, hands clasped, his face still taut from the tension that had closed out the segment. Elon, meanwhile, stared ahead, eyes flicking occasionally toward Colbert like a man still calculating his next move, refusing to show defeat even after being knocked off balance. They didn't speak during the break, not a word. The usual pleasantries between host and guest were absent. Even the makeup artist, normally quick to rush over for a powder touch-up, hesitated before stepping toward Elon. His energy was uninviting, cold, almost volatile. When the cameras returned and the show resumed, it was clear to everyone watching that the tension hadn't eased. If anything, it had deepened. What followed was unlike anything ever seen on late-night television. Stephen opened the next segment not with a joke, not with a soft toss to another topic, but with a direct challenge. He brought up one of Elon's recent interviews, one in which Musk had been criticized for downplaying serious workplace complaints at one of his factories. The topic had been considered off-limits in the pre-show notes, but Stephen didn't care. The gloves were off. Elon didn't appreciate the ambush. His smile returned, but it wasn't the same smugness as before. It was tighter, defensive, like a man trying to keep control of a storm from inside the eye of it. He responded with deflection, suggesting the claims were overblown and that he was the victim of media distortion. But Stephen wasn't satisfied. He pressed harder, drawing parallels between Musk's dismissive behavior during the interview and the very accusations that had plagued him. This wasn't about gotcha journalism. It was about integrity, and Stephen made that known, not by yelling, but by leaning into the facts, by holding up a mirror to the guest who had walked in expecting worship and instead found scrutiny. Elon pushed back, not with logic, but with venom. He called out Stephen's network, questioned the journalistic ethics of the show, and even implied that late-night television was the last resort for men whose voices were no longer relevant in the real world. The audience gasped. It wasn't just a dig. It was an insult aimed at Stephen's very identity, his years of work, and the platform he had built. For a moment it looked like Colbert might shut it down, that he might wrap the segment early and cut to the next guest. But instead, he leaned in again, this time even more composed. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead of responding in kind, he pulled from a place far more dangerous than rage. He brought up Elon's past, not the usual headlines, but the overlooked stories, the whistleblowers, the scientists who had parted ways, the communities left fractured in the wake of ambitious projects that had promised too much and delivered too little. Each fact was calmly delivered, each example sharpened to a point. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was an autopsy of ego disguised as conversation. Elon's expression darkened. His shoulders stiffened, his replies became sharper, more erratic. He started calling out hypocrisy, accusing Stephen of grandstanding, pretending to be a moral compass while profiting from controversy. He suggested the entire segment was a trap, crafted to bait him into a meltdown that would drive ratings. The crowd began to murmur again, not with excitement but with unease. That's when Stephen turned the tables entirely. He addressed the audience, calmly but with force. He acknowledged that yes, this was entertainment, but entertainment rooted in truth, in accountability, in giving people a space to see past the polished surfaces of the rich and powerful. He wasn't interested in destroying Elon Musk. He was interested in showing the man behind the mask. And tonight, the mask was slipping. The live audience shifted in tone. They leaned in, some clapping, not out of habit but from a place of solidarity. The conversation had transformed from awkward tension to something more profound, something uncomfortable but necessary. Elon realized he was losing the room. The confidence that had carried him into the studio was cracking under the weight of unexpected resistance. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. He launched into a rant, painting himself as a misunderstood visionary, comparing himself to historic figures who had been ridiculed before being vindicated. The rhetoric was grand, even poetic in places, but it reeked of desperation. It was the sound of a man clinging to a version of himself that the world was no longer buying in full. Stephen, however, didn't interrupt. He let Elon finish, let him speak without cutting in. When the rant ended, Stephen simply nodded, let the silence hang, and then responded with one of the calmest, most devastating lines of the night. A line that landed like a hammer in a library, one that made even the band go quiet. Elon sat back, visibly rattled. The audience watched him carefully. Now, not as a tech genius or celebrity, but as a man exposed. The illusion of invincibility had cracked. The air was thinner now, stripped of all casual charm, with nothing but tension holding the conversation together. Stephen remained still in his chair, his posture dignified, but his eyes revealed how deep this confrontation had cut. Elon sat. Across from him, arms folded, legs crossed, but every movement was slightly delayed, slightly too deliberate. It was clear he was no longer in control of the room. He was surviving it. The audience, once an active participant in the spectacle, had grown quieter, more focused. They weren't laughing or gasping anymore. They were watching with a kind of uncomfortable awe. What had begun as an awkward interview had become something raw, exposing the difference between influence and respect. Elon still had one. He had lost the other. Stephen pivoted next, not with an attack, but with a surprising turn toward empathy. He questioned why Elon, with all his brilliance, wealth, and reach, felt the need to condescend instead of connect. Why someone with the power to change the world chose instead to mock the very people he claimed to want to help. There was no malice in Stephen's tone, but it struck even harder than anything before. It sounded like disappointment, and that was far more dangerous than outrage. But Elon didn't welcome this olive branch. He saw it as a trick, a performance move meant to sway the public. He scoffed at the sentiment, rolled his eyes, and accused Stephen of playing the hero for claps and headlines. His voice sharpened again, rising with each word. He insisted he didn't owe anyone an apology for being direct, for thinking differently, for not pretending to care about social norms that stifled innovation. He labeled the audience sheep, called late-night shows vanity platforms for second-tier minds, and reminded everyone that without people like him, the future would collapse. The room chilled. What followed was Stephen's final break from showmanship. No more jokes, no more playful tone. He began recounting, slowly and without exaggeration, the stories of workers inside Elon's companies. Real people, with names and faces. Stories of burnout, fear, silenced complaints. He mentioned towns where factories had promised growth but delivered silence after laying off hundreds. And he pointed out the irony. A man who built rockets to escape the planet had no idea what was crumbling beneath his feet. Elon responded with disdain. He argued that he had created more opportunity than anyone else in the room ever would, that he had pulled humanity forward while others made noise, that sacrifices had to be made. His voice cracked, not with emotion, but with frustration. He wasn't winning. No clever retort could save the moment now. The audience had stopped reacting to him altogether, and that's when it happened. A member of the audience stood up. Then another. It wasn't planned, but it was powerful. The cameras didn't cut away. They caught everything. The standing crowd wasn't protesting Elon. They were silently applauding Stephen, acknowledging Not just his courage, but the very purpose of the platform he defended. Not entertainment for the sake of distraction, but a moment of reckoning. Stephen didn't revel in it. He looked tired but grounded. He addressed Elon one last time, not as a rival, but as a man staring down another who had lost sight of why he ever started. He spoke of legacy, not in terms of buildings or rockets, but of how people remembered you when the spotlight faded. He asked if being right was more important to Elon than being decent, and then he let the silence return. Elon, uncharacteristically, had no response. There was a stillness to him now, like he was reeling internally, measuring what had just happened. He didn't storm off, didn't erupt. He stayed seated, but he shrank in that chair in a way that no angle or lighting could hide. The crowd's attention shifted fully to Stephen. For once, the man who made others laugh had made them reflect. Backstage, producers scrambled, unsure whether to wrap the segment or extend it. But on stage, both men remained. And though they occupied the same space, it was clear the balance had shifted for good. The show neared its end, but no one in the building seemed concerned with the clock anymore. What had just unfolded on live television had left an imprint, unfiltered, brutal, and unforgettable. Stephen Colbert, known for his wit and clever critiques, had dismantled Elon Musk's facade without shouting, without showboating. And now, in the final moments, the only thing left was resolution. Not the kind scripted in rehearsals, but something real. Elon remained seated, staring ahead, the tension still etched into every movement. His hands fidgeted, his breathing unsteady. He looked not defeated, but unmoored. There was no anger left to throw, no words left that could shift the atmosphere. Whatever ego had walked in with him had been left shattered across the studio floor. Stephen adjusted in his chair. He didn't gloat. He didn't take a victory lap. Instead, he acknowledged the silence and leaned into it. He took a deep breath and addressed the viewers directly, not with laughter, not with sarcasm, but with the quiet strength of a man who knew the weight of the moment. He reflected on the night not as a feud, but as a symptom of something bigger, a growing divide between power and accountability, between wealth and wisdom. He thanked the audience for bearing witness to something uncomfortable. He thanked his staff for their professionalism, and then, with deliberate grace, he offered a perspective Elon hadn't expected. The possibility that even giants need to be challenged, not to bring them down, but to keep them honest. That a true innovator welcomes critique, rather than hiding behind pride. Elon didn't respond. Not immediately. But as the final moments ticked away, he looked up. Just once. His expression was not humbled, but it wasn't smug either. It was complicated. He looked like a man who had spent years shaping the future, only to be forced to confront the present he had neglected. There was no apology, no handshake. Just a long pause, a nod, and the quiet acceptance that tonight had not gone as he had expected. The credits rolled, but no one in the audience moved. They remained standing, many still clapping, not with wild enthusiasm, but with respect. Respect for the host who had refused to be steamrolled, who had stood firm against arrogance cloaked as brilliance, and who had done so with composure and clarity. Backstage, Elon walked alone. His team trailed him, hushed and unsure. He didn't say a word as he exited the studio. There were no social media posts that night, no carefully edited clips, just silence. It was the first time in a long time that the world saw Elon Musk not as a myth, but as a man. Stephen remained behind, speaking, briefly with producers. He was quiet, exhausted even, but steady. There was no celebration. Just an awareness that something important had happened, something the cameras only partially captured. In the age of noise and spectacle, a line had been drawn, and he had drawn it with clarity. In the days that followed, clips from the interview exploded across the internet. Some called it brutal, Others called it necessary. Commentators from both sides weighed in, dissecting every glance, every pause. But the overwhelming reaction was not about who won or lost. It was about the courage to confront power without losing composure, about standing tall when the easier path would have been silence. Stephen Colbert's reputation didn't just remain intact, it deepened. Viewers saw him not only as a comedian or host, but as someone who understood that words matter, especially when directed at those whose actions affect millions. As for Elon, the moment lingered. He returned to his work, continued to launch rockets and unveil new technology, but with an altered public gaze. No longer untouchable, no longer beyond critique, and perhaps, in a small way, better for it. The episode was later regarded not as a scandal, but a watershed, a moment where entertainment collided with truth, and one man reminded the world that brilliance without humility is not progress, but a warning. And with that, the story reached its close, not with applause or drama, but with the quiet echo of a reckoning heard around the world.